It started with a question that no one in finance could answer. Where did his money come from? He manages wealth, someone said. For who? No one knew. Yet the man at the center of that mystery lived like royalty. Private jets waiting on runways. A Manhattan mansion that towered over the Upper East Side. A private island in the Caribbean where celebrities, politicians, and billionaires were rumored to visit. For decades, Jeffrey Epstein moved comfortably among the most powerful people in the world. And almost nobody asked how he got there, until the accusations began. In the 1980s and 1990s, Epstein cultivated an image of brilliance. He spoke confidently about markets and strategy, presenting himself as a financial mastermind who specialized in managing wealth for the ultra-rich. His connections seemed to confirm the story. He was seen alongside powerful figures, including Bill Clinton and Britain's Prince Andrew. His social circle included billionaires, celebrities, and political leaders. To outsiders, Epstein looked like a man who had mastered the art of influence. But behind the image of wealth and exclusivity, investigators would later uncover something far darker. Because Epstein's fortune was only part of the story. The real mystery was how he used it. One of the first signs that something was wrong came from Florida. In the early 2000s, local police in Palm Beach began receiving disturbing reports. Several young girls claimed they had been recruited to give Epstein massages at his mansion. At first, the stories sounded strange but isolated. But then more reports came in, and then more. Soon investigators realized the allegations followed a pattern. Young girls, some as young as teenagers, said they had been approached by recruiters promising easy money. The job sounded simple. Visit a wealthy man's home and provide a massage. But according to victims, the situation quickly turned sexual. Some said they were pressured into acts they didn't fully understand. Others said they were encouraged to recruit additional girls, creating a chain that continued expanding. The Palm Beach Police Department began building a case. Detectives interviewed victims. They documented accounts that were disturbingly similar. They searched Epstein's mansion and found evidence supporting the allegations. By the mid-2000s, authorities believed they were dealing with something far more serious than isolated misconduct. They suspected a system, a network that allegedly targeted vulnerable girls. But bringing charges against someone like Epstein was never going to be simple, because he wasn't just wealthy, he was connected. The investigation quickly attracted national attention. Federal authorities began reviewing the evidence collected by Palm Beach police. Prosecutors considered multiple charges related to trafficking and abuse. Victims hoped the case would finally expose what had been happening behind the gates of Epstein's mansion. But what happened next shocked many of the people involved. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial plea agreement with federal prosecutors. Instead of facing numerous federal charges, he pleaded guilty to state charges related to solicitation. The deal allowed him to avoid a potentially lengthy federal prison sentence. Instead, he served a relatively short term in a county jail. Even more controversial were the conditions of his confinement. During part of his sentence, Epstein was reportedly allowed to leave jail during the day for work release, returning at night. For many victims, the outcome felt like justice had slipped away. Legal experts and journalists began asking difficult questions. Why had prosecutors agreed to such an unusual deal? Why were the victims not fully informed about the agreement beforehand? The answers would not emerge for years. But one thing was clear: the case was far from over. Despite the scandal, Epstein continued moving within elite circles. He maintained properties in multiple locations, including a mansion in New York City and an island in the Caribbean often referred to in media reports as Little St. James. Rumors about what happened on that island circulated widely. Some visitors claimed it was simply a private retreat for wealthy friends. Others described something far more disturbing. Journalists and investigators began examining Epstein's travel records. Flight logs connected his private aircraft to numerous high-profile passengers over the years. Among those whose names appeared in various reports were politicians, celebrities, and influential businessmen. But appearing on a flight log did not mean involvement in wrongdoing. And that complexity made the story even more explosive. because separating rumor from verified evidence proved extremely difficult. Still, the Epstein story refused to disappear. Survivors continued speaking out. Civil lawsuits were filed. Investigative reporters kept digging through records and testimony. Slowly, new information began surfacing. One of the most persistent voices calling for accountability was Virginia Giuffre, who publicly accused Epstein and associates of trafficking and abuse. Her claims, along with those of other women, reignited public interest in the case. As pressure mounted, journalists uncovered new documents related to the earlier investigation and the controversial plea agreement. The revelations triggered outrage. Critics argued that Epstein had received preferential treatment because of his wealth and connections. Federal officials eventually reopened aspects of the investigation. For the first time in years, it seemed possible that the full scope of Epstein's activities might finally be examined. But the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the story became. Because Epstein's life intersected with so many powerful individuals that every new discovery carried political and legal consequences. Some former associates denied wrongdoing. Others refused to comment. Meanwhile, survivors continued pushing for answers. They wanted to know who else might have been involved. They wanted accountability, and they wanted the world to understand what had happened. By the late 2010s, the Epstein story had evolved into one of the most talked about scandals in modern American history. Journalists, prosecutors, and victims were all asking the same question. How had a man accused by so many managed to avoid serious consequences for so long? The answer, investigators suspected, might lie in the web of connections surrounding him. Wealth, influence, power, all of it seemed to orbit around Epstein. But influence can only shield someone for so long, because eventually, the weight of allegations becomes impossible to ignore. And by 2019, federal authorities decided the time had come to act again. What happened next would shock the world. A dramatic arrest, a federal indictment, and a chain of events that would transform the Epstein case from a scandal into one of the most controversial mysteries in modern true crime. Because the man who had spent decades moving quietly among the powerful was about to become the center of a global storm. And once investigators began opening the files connected to his life, they would uncover secrets that raised a far more disturbing question. Was Jeffrey Epstein acting alone? Or was he part of something much bigger? In the next chapter, we dive deeper into the network of allegations, private flights, and hidden connections that investigators say surrounded Epstein for years. Detective, you need to see this. What is it? Another victim statement. How many does that make now? More than 20. And they're all saying the same thing? Yes. A long pause. The same man, the same houses, and the same private plane. By the early 2000s, investigators were beginning to realize something deeply disturbing. The accusations against Jeffrey Epstein were no longer isolated stories. They were forming a pattern. And that pattern pointed to a network that stretched far beyond one man. When detectives in Palm Beach first began hearing reports about Epstein's activities, they assumed they were dealing with a local case, a wealthy man accused of inappropriate conduct. But as investigators interviewed more young women, the allegations began revealing something far more organized. Many victims described a similar process. A friend would approach them with an opportunity to earn money. Just a massage, they were told. Sometimes they were offered $200 or more for a short visit to Epstein's mansion. For teenagers or young women from struggling families, that amount of money could be life-changing. But according to the victims' accounts, the situation often escalated quickly once they arrived. The alleged massages would turn into sexual encounters. Some girls said they felt pressured or manipulated. Others said they were asked to bring friends. Recruitment became part of the system. Each new person brought into the network was encouraged to recruit others. Investigators later described it as a pyramid structure that allowed the operation to grow quietly. And it wasn't limited to one location. Epstein owned several properties across the United States and abroad. A mansion in Manhattan, a massive estate in Palm Beach, a ranch in New Mexico, and a private Caribbean island. But the house that first drew law enforcement attention was the Palm Beach property. Behind its high walls and security gates, victims said the same routine played out repeatedly. Visitors would arrive. Staff would escort them inside, and Epstein would meet them alone in a massage room. As detectives pieced together these stories, they began collecting physical evidence. Phone records, visitor logs, statements from employees. The case was slowly taking shape, but investigators also noticed something unusual. Epstein's lifestyle extended far beyond Palm Beach, and so did the travel connected to him. One of the most mysterious aspects of Epstein's life was his private aircraft. Often referred to in media reports as the Lolita Express, the plane became infamous after journalists obtained flight logs that documented years of travel. The aircraft had carried Epstein and various guests to destinations around the world. The passenger lists contained names that immediately drew attention. Among them were prominent public figures, including Bill Clinton and Britain's Prince Andrew. However, appearing on a flight log did not imply involvement in criminal activity. Many people who had traveled with Epstein later stated they were unaware of any wrongdoing. Still, the existence of those records intensified public curiosity. Who else had traveled with Epstein? What exactly happened during those trips? And how much did his powerful acquaintances know? Investigators continued looking for answers. Another location began attracting increasing scrutiny: Epstein's private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Officially named Little St. James, the island became one of the most talked about places connected to the case. Some former visitors described it as a luxurious retreat. White beaches, private villas, security guards, and limited access. But others claimed it was the setting for disturbing activities. Victims alleged they had been flown there and pressured into sexual encounters. Because the island was privately owned, access was tightly controlled. For investigators, proving what happened there was far more complicated than documenting events in a U.S. city. Yet the stories continued, and with each new accusation, the possibility of a broader operation became harder to ignore. As the investigation progressed, detectives started focusing on the people around Epstein: assistants, drivers, house managers, recruiters. Some employees claimed they knew nothing about illegal activities. Others admitted they had been instructed to arrange appointments or manage schedules for visitors. Law enforcement began asking a key question: was Epstein acting alone, or were other people helping him operate the network? At the center of that question was Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell, a British socialite and longtime associate of Epstein, had been a regular presence in his life. According to several accusers, Maxwell helped recruit young girls and sometimes participated in the abuse. Maxwell strongly denied the allegations for years, but her connection to Epstein made investigators increasingly interested in her role. If prosecutors could prove that more people were involved, the case would expand dramatically. Meanwhile, journalists began uncovering additional details about Epstein's world. Former friends described lavish dinner parties attended by famous guests. Financial experts questioned the origins of his fortune. Epstein had once worked briefly as a teacher before moving into finance, eventually claiming to manage money for wealthy clients. But the full source of his wealth remained difficult to verify. Some observers described his financial empire as mysterious. Others suggested he specialized in serving ultra-rich individuals who valued privacy above all else. Whatever the truth, Epstein's money gave him extraordinary influence. It allowed him to move in elite circles where few people questioned his background, and it may have helped shield him from scrutiny for years. But that protection was beginning to weaken. By the mid-2000s, the number of victims speaking out had grown significantly. Many described similar experiences, similar locations, similar methods of recruitment. Their accounts were difficult to dismiss. And yet, despite mounting evidence, the legal outcome would soon shock the country. Because instead of a sweeping federal prosecution, Epstein received the controversial plea agreement that allowed him to avoid a potentially lengthy prison sentence. To victims, it felt like the system had failed them. But the story was not finished. The evidence gathered during those early investigations would remain in records and files for years. waiting for the moment when someone would reopen the case. Because even after the plea deal, the allegations continued. New victims came forward. Civil lawsuits were filed. Journalists kept digging. And slowly, the world began realizing that the Epstein story might be far bigger than anyone first believed. It wasn't just about one man accused of terrible crimes. It was about the possibility of a hidden network, a web of power, wealth, and influence that had allowed those crimes to continue for years. And as more documents surfaced and more victims spoke publicly, pressure began building on federal authorities to take another look. Eventually, that pressure would lead to one of the most dramatic arrests in modern American true crime. An arrest that shocked the world and promised to expose secrets many powerful people hoped would remain hidden. But when that moment finally arrived, something happened that no one expected, and the mystery surrounding Epstein would grow even deeper. Did you see the news? Yeah. They arrested him. When? This morning. Where? At the airport. Pause. So it's finally happening? Yes, after all these years. They finally caught Jeffrey Epstein. But no one knew yet that the arrest would ignite one of the most explosive criminal investigations in modern American history. For more than a decade, the allegations surrounding Epstein had never fully disappeared. Victims had continued speaking out. Journalists kept publishing investigations. Civil lawsuits slowly revealed new details about the network Epstein allegedly operated. But for years, federal authorities had not filed new criminal charges. That changed in the summer of 2019. On July 6th, Epstein stepped off his private jet at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Federal agents were waiting. Within moments, they placed him under arrest. The charges were serious: sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The arrest shocked the country. For many observers, it seemed almost impossible that Epstein had managed to avoid major prosecution for so long. Now, suddenly, the case had returned with enormous force. And this time, it was in the hands of federal prosecutors in New York. Investigators quickly began revealing new evidence. One of the most dramatic moments came when agents searched Epstein's Manhattan mansion. The house itself was extraordinary. Located on East 71st Street, it was one of the largest private homes in New York City. But what agents reportedly discovered inside raised serious questions. According to court filings, investigators found large quantities of photographs, hard drives, and CDs locked inside a safe. Some of those materials were described as explicit images of young girls. Federal prosecutors later argued that the evidence supported the claims that Epstein had operated a trafficking scheme for years. The discovery intensified public interest in the case. People wanted to know how far the network extended and who else might be implicated. The arrest also triggered renewed scrutiny of Epstein's past relationships with powerful individuals. For decades, he had moved comfortably among wealthy and influential figures, business leaders, politicians, celebrities. His connections included former U.S. President Bill Clinton and British Royal Prince Andrew. Both men denied wrongdoing related to Epstein, but their past associations with him became the subject of intense public debate. How had Epstein gained access to such influential circles? And why had so many powerful people maintained relationships with him despite growing allegations? These questions dominated news coverage. The story was no longer just a criminal case. It had become a global scandal. As Epstein awaited trial, federal prosecutors began building their case. The indictment focused primarily on activities that allegedly took place in New York and Florida between 2002 and 2005. Victims described a system in which Epstein paid girls for sexual encounters and encouraged them to recruit others. Prosecutors argued that the operation functioned like a trafficking network. Victims were allegedly flown to Epstein's homes. Some were transported on his private aircraft. Others said they had been taken to his private island in the Caribbean. For investigators, proving these allegations required assembling years of evidence. Victim testimony, travel records, financial transactions, phone data. The case was growing rapidly, but another development soon changed everything. The public reaction to Epstein's arrest was enormous. Millions of people followed every update. News networks ran constant coverage. Social media exploded with speculation. Many observers believed the trial could reveal secrets about powerful figures who had interacted with Epstein. Some victims also hoped the court process would finally provide justice after years of silence. But before the trial could begin, something happened that stunned the world. On August 10, 2019, just weeks after his arrest, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. The official ruling later determined the cause of death to be suicide. However, the circumstances immediately raised questions. How could one of the most high-profile prisoners in the United States die while in federal custody? Why were certain security procedures reportedly not followed that night? Why were the guards assigned to monitor him allegedly asleep or distracted? The death triggered widespread outrage. For victims, it felt like another devastating blow. For investigators, it meant the criminal case against Epstein himself would never go to trial. But that did not mean the investigation was over, because prosecutors were already examining the roles of others connected to him. Attention soon turned toward Epstein's longtime associate Ghislaine Maxwell. For years, several victims had accused Maxwell of helping Epstein recruit young girls. According to those allegations, she sometimes participated in the abuse and helped arrange encounters. Maxwell had denied the claims repeatedly. After Epstein's death, she largely disappeared from public view. Reporters tried to track her location. Law enforcement agencies began searching for her. For nearly a year, her whereabouts remained unknown. Then, in July 2020, federal agents located her in New Hampshire. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to Epstein's trafficking operation. The arrest signaled that prosecutors were still determined to pursue justice, even without Epstein himself. Maxwell's trial would later become one of the most closely watched court cases in the United States. Witnesses described disturbing experiences from years earlier. Prosecutors presented testimony from several women who said they had been recruited as teenagers. The trial forced the public to confront the scope of Epstein's alleged network. In December 2021, a jury found Maxwell guilty on several charges related to sex trafficking. She was later sentenced to 20 years in prison. For some victims, the verdict represented a long-awaited acknowledgement of their suffering. But for others, it was only part of the story, because many questions about Epstein's network remained unanswered. Who funded his lifestyle? Who traveled with him regularly? Who else might have known what was happening? Those questions continued to fuel investigations by journalists and civil attorneys. More documents began emerging through lawsuits, flight logs, depositions, financial records. Each new piece of evidence seemed to suggest that Epstein's world had been far larger than originally believed. And the possibility that additional powerful figures might be implicated kept the public watching closely. The story had already taken dramatic turns, but its most explosive revelations were still ahead. Because hidden within thousands of pages of legal files were details that could reshape how the world understood the Epstein network. And when those documents finally began to surface, the scandal would reach an entirely new level. A level where names, secrets, and powerful connections could no longer remain hidden. Wait, did you see the court filing? Which one? The documents released today. What documents? The sealed files. Pause. Whose names are in them? That's what everyone is trying to find out. By early 2020, the case surrounding Jeffrey Epstein had taken on a new life, one that moved far beyond a single criminal prosecution. Because even though Epstein himself was gone, thousands of pages of sealed court documents still existed. And inside those documents were testimonies, depositions, and investigative records that had never been fully revealed to the public. For journalists, attorneys, and victims, those files represented something critical: answers. Many of the documents came from a long-running civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Jeffrey against Epstein's associate Ghislaine Maxwell. Jeffrey had accused Maxwell of recruiting her as a teenager and introducing her to Epstein. The lawsuit included years of testimony, witness statements, and legal arguments. Much of it had remained sealed under court orders. But after intense pressure from journalists and victims' advocates, courts began allowing portions of the files to be unsealed. The releases happened gradually, page by page, document by document. Each new filing sparked intense media coverage, because people believed the documents might reveal something explosive: the identities of powerful individuals connected to Epstein. It's important to understand something about those files. Many names appeared in them, but appearing in a legal document did not mean someone had committed a crime. In many cases, individuals were simply mentioned in witness testimony or legal arguments. Still, the public reaction was enormous. People around the world were searching for one thing: the rumored client list. For years, rumors had circulated that Epstein maintained records of influential figures who visited his properties. But investigators had never confirmed the existence of a formal list. What the documents did contain were references to meetings, travel records, and statements describing Epstein's social circle. And that circle had once included some of the most powerful people in the world. Among the names repeatedly discussed in media coverage was Britain's Prince Andrew. Jeffrey had alleged that she was forced to have sexual encounters with him when she was underage. Prince Andrew strongly denied the allegations. However, the controversy caused enormous public backlash. In 2019, he gave a widely criticized television interview attempting to address the accusations. The interview raised more questions than it answered, and the pressure on the royal family quickly intensified. Eventually, Prince Andrew stepped back from official royal duties. Later, in 2022, he reached a financial settlement with Jeffrey in a civil case, though the settlement did not include an admission of guilt. The situation demonstrated just how far Epstein's scandal had reached, from American courtrooms to the highest levels of international power. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing financial records tied to Epstein's estate. When Epstein died in 2019, his fortune was estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had placed much of that wealth into a trust. Attorneys representing victims began filing claims against the estate. Eventually, a compensation program was created to provide financial settlements to individuals who had been harmed. More than 100 claims were submitted. The program ultimately distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to victims. While no amount of money could undo what had happened, many participants said the process offered a form of acknowledgement that had been missing for years. But legal battles were far from finished, because Epstein's business operations and financial relationships still remained partly unexplained. Investigators also continued examining properties once owned by Epstein. Among the most mysterious was his private Caribbean island, Little St. James. The island had long been the subject of rumors and allegations. Some former visitors described it as a luxurious getaway. Others claimed disturbing events took place there. After Epstein's death, authorities searched the island as part of ongoing investigations. Drones captured images of unusual structures, including a small temple-like building that had fueled speculation online. However, many questions about the island remain unanswered. Without Epstein himself alive to testify, proving what happened there became far more complicated. Another lingering mystery involved Epstein's finances. For decades, he had maintained relationships with extremely wealthy individuals, but the exact nature of his business dealings remained unclear. Some clients reportedly trusted him to manage large investments. Others claimed he provided specialized financial advice. Yet investigators struggled to identify how Epstein accumulated such extraordinary wealth. Financial experts noted that his business empire seemed unusually opaque. Companies were registered in multiple jurisdictions. Assets were held through complex legal structures. Tracing the true flow of money proved extremely difficult. For journalists, that financial secrecy became another critical piece of the puzzle. Because if Epstein had been running a trafficking operation for years, it likely required significant funding and logistical support. Understanding the money could help explain how the network functioned. Despite years of investigation, the Epstein story still contains many unanswered questions. Who else may have been involved in recruiting victims? Were additional crimes committed outside the locations already documented? Did other powerful individuals know what was happening? Law enforcement agencies have repeatedly stated that investigations into related matters continue. However, many records remain sealed or restricted due to ongoing legal proceedings and privacy protections. For victims and advocates, the search for truth remains deeply personal. Many survivors say they came forward not only to hold perpetrators accountable, but also to prevent similar crimes from happening in the future. Their testimonies transformed what might have remained hidden allegations into one of the most widely discussed criminal scandals in modern history. And yet, even after court cases, arrests, and document releases, one final mystery still looms over the entire story: the night Epstein died. Because while authorities ruled his death a suicide, the circumstances surrounding it continue to be debated. Security failures, missing surveillance footage, guards who reportedly did not follow required procedures. These details fueled endless speculation. But the truth behind that night remains one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. And in the next chapter, we look at the final and most chilling question of all. If Epstein's secrets died with him, then who still knows the truth? And what might still be hidden inside the files that have yet to be revealed? Go ahead. Status check on inmate. A few seconds of silence. He's not responding. What do you mean not responding? Sir, you need to get down here. The date was August 10th, 2019. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, correctional officers approached the cell of one of the most infamous prisoners in the United States. The inmate was Jeffrey Epstein. Minutes later, the news would begin spreading across the country. Epstein was dead, and within hours, a new mystery had begun. Epstein's death shocked the world. Just weeks earlier, federal prosecutors had charged him with sex trafficking of minors in a case that many believed could expose powerful individuals connected to his network. The trial promised dramatic testimony. Victims were preparing to speak publicly. Evidence collected during the investigation was expected to reveal details about Epstein's operations that had never before been disclosed. But that trial would never happen. Instead, authorities announced that Epstein had died in his jail cell. The official ruling later determined the cause of death to be suicide. Yet almost immediately, questions began to emerge. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, often called MCC, was known as one of the most secure detention facilities in the country. It had housed high-profile prisoners including organized crime figures, international criminals, and major financial offenders. In theory, a prisoner like Epstein would be closely monitored, especially because he had already been placed on suicide watch earlier in his detention. But on the night of his death, several critical failures reportedly occurred. According to later investigations, the two correctional officers assigned to monitor Epstein's unit had not performed required checks for several hours. Security cameras outside the area also malfunctioned. When officers finally entered the cell in the early morning hours, Epstein was found unresponsive. Emergency responders attempted life-saving measures, but he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The news triggered immediate outrage. For many victims, Epstein's death felt devastating. They had waited years for justice. Some had prepared to testify in open court. Now, the main criminal case against the man accused of abusing them was gone. One survivor later said the moment felt like the door to the truth had been slammed shut. Because without Epstein alive to face trial, many details about his alleged network might never be revealed in court. But federal authorities insisted the investigation itself was not over. They made it clear that Epstein's associates could still face prosecution. And eventually, that promise led to the arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell had been one of Epstein's closest companions for decades. Several accusers alleged she helped recruit teenage girls and facilitated encounters between Epstein and victims. After Epstein's death, Maxwell remained out of public view for nearly a year. Then, in July 2020, federal agents tracked her to a secluded property in New Hampshire. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to sex trafficking. Her trial became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in the United States. During the trial, witnesses described how the recruitment process allegedly worked. Young girls were introduced to Epstein under the promise of money. Some were encouraged to bring friends. Prosecutors argued that Maxwell had played a key role in maintaining that system. In December 2021, a jury found Maxwell guilty on several charges. She was later sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. For some victims, the verdict represented a measure of accountability. But many questions remained unanswered. Even today, investigators and journalists continue examining the broader network surrounding Epstein. Thousands of pages of legal documents remain partially sealed. Civil lawsuits have uncovered additional financial records and testimonies. Victims' attorneys have argued that Epstein could not have operated alone for so many years, maintaining properties in multiple countries, operating private aircraft, moving money through complex financial systems. All of that required resources and possibly assistance from others. Determining who knew what and when has become one of the central mysteries of the entire case. Another focus of ongoing discussion involves Epstein's extensive list of acquaintances. Over the years, he built relationships with politicians, business leaders, academics, and celebrities. Among those whose past interactions with Epstein have drawn public attention are former U.S. President Bill Clinton and Britain's Prince Andrew. Both men have denied any involvement in Epstein's crimes. Still, the connections highlight how Epstein managed to move within elite social circles for decades. And they raise a difficult question. How did someone facing serious allegations continue to maintain influence among powerful people for so long? Financial investigations have also attempted to unravel the origins of Epstein's wealth. He claimed to manage investments for extremely wealthy clients. Yet, the details of those financial operations were often difficult to verify. Some experts described his financial empire as unusually secretive. Companies connected to Epstein were registered in multiple countries. Assets were held through trusts and offshore entities. This complex structure made it challenging to trace the true sources of his fortune. Understanding that money trail could potentially reveal more about how his operation functioned. But many of those financial records remain private. Despite everything that has happened, the arrests, the trials, the document releases, the Epstein case still leaves behind a long list of unresolved questions. What other evidence might still exist? How many victims have yet to come forward? Were there additional participants who have never been publicly identified? And perhaps most controversially, did Epstein take secrets with him when he died? For millions of people around the world, the story feels unfinished. Not because investigators have stopped working, but because the scale of the scandal appears larger than the legal outcomes that have occurred so far. What began as allegations in a quiet Florida neighborhood eventually turned into one of the most discussed criminal cases of the 21st century. It exposed the vulnerability of young victims. It revealed the influence wealth can have on legal outcomes. And it forced institutions, from law enforcement agencies to political systems, to confront difficult questions about power and accountability. For survivors, the most important legacy of the case may be the attention it brought to the issue of trafficking and exploitation. Their voices transformed a hidden story into a global conversation, and their courage ensured that the truth, however complicated, would not remain buried forever. But perhaps the most haunting part of the Epstein story is this: the investigation may never fully close. Because somewhere in sealed documents, archived flight records, or forgotten financial accounts, there may still be pieces of the story waiting to be uncovered. Pieces that could reveal how the network really worked. Pieces that could explain how it operated for so long. And pieces that might finally answer the question the world has been asking for years. What secrets did Jeffrey Epstein leave behind? The files may hold the answer, but until every page is revealed, the mystery continues.